I think most people are aware by now, but this morning John came in and informed Trevor and myself that he is choosing not to continue as coach of our football club. That's obviously a sad day for the club, given if you think about the fact that John's been with us for 24 of our 27 years, either as a player or as a coach, and is an absolute legend of this club.
So at the end of the 2013 season, John Worsfold called time on an amazing 12-year career as West Coast Eagles coach. As a fan, this was particularly devastating for me, but he did have a long, successful career, and I think at the end of it, some personal issues kind of got in the way of his coaching career. I don't think at the end of that time, his heart was really in it. The way the Eagles fell from being, they were Premiership favourite going into the 2013 season, and then finished 13th on the ladder. And I think in our last 3 games, we lost them all by 10 goals, and 2 of those were at home, won by 86 points against Adelaide. And, with the talent we had on the list at that time, that was a massive underachievement, and I think we all knew something was a bit rotten. So he did the unselfish thing. He stood aside and someone else had to be appointed as West Coast Eagles coach. Now, it was super important that the Eagles picked the right man for obvious reasons. We hadn't done a recruiting drive for a coach in 12 years, obviously, since Ken Judge was replaced by Woosha. And back then we had an obvious choice. Woosha was probably the right man to go with at the time, being a favourite son. But this time we had 4 main contenders for the role. One was Lee Tudor, the other Adam Simpson, Peter Sumich, and Scott Burns. You had Scott Burns and Peter Sumich were sort of internally involved. Sumich is obviously a favourite son of the Eagles. Scott Burns was a current assistant coach at the club. And then you had some external views like Tudor and Simpson. And I think the external view of those guys sort of intrigued a lot of us fans at the time, because we thought, there was a bit of a stale sort of perspective at the Eagles with their list. And I think a fresh set of eyes would have added a lot of value. In the end, as we know, Adam Simpson won out. And I think we all knew the attraction for him, other than his playing pedigree, was the fact that he was a student of Al Clarkson, coming from that Hawthorn setup, and we thought maybe a sort of Hawthorn perspective on our playing list was particularly exciting. So we were finally able to have a fresh set of eyes look at the strengths and weaknesses of that West Coast Eagles list, which at the time was really strong in terms of tools, both forward and back, but the midfield was a really big concern. Prentice was part of that problem because we were very one-paced. So being recruited at the end of the 2013 season, Simo obviously had a short turnaround before he had to go on his first recruiting drive, but it ended up being a really successful offseason in that respect. We drafted Dom Sheed and we drafted Tom Barras. We traded in Elliot Yeo, and Simpson also brought in Xavier Ellis. The one thing Simo had going for him was that at the end of the 2013 season, which was so disastrous, 2014, our expectations were relatively conservative. We just wanted to see improvement and maybe a change in the playing style, and if we made finals, that would be an absolute bonus. What we wanted to see was a transition towards maybe a more modern game style, and we always thought this squad that we had the talent for a premiership tilt, but we just didn't quite have the right game plan to suit that. The start to Simpson's actual career in 2014 was an absolute breeze. In round 1, we dispatched the Dogs easily. We then played Melbourne at the G and won by nearly 100 points before beating the Saints to make it 3 from 3. But after that run of games, we had our annual loss to Geelong in Cardinia. We got absolutely slaughtered, and we went from going 3 from 3 to losing 4 on the trot, and then we snapped that streak with an over 100-point win against GWS, and JK actually kicked 11 goals. As you would expect from a coach in his first season playing a new style, we were playing some horribly inconsistent football. In fact, in particular, I remember some terrible home losses against North, Richmond, and Sydney in Perth, and for an Eagles fan, I wasn't overly accustomed to that. Even when we were average, we were usually a decent shout at home. At this stage, it did appear we were actually closer to being a bottom 4 team than a top 8 team, and even for the most patient Eagles fan, that was pretty hard to tolerate. But I actually remember the game where everything appeared to change under Adam Simpson. It was round 19, we were taking on the Crows at Adelaide Oval. Given our indifferent form up to that point in the season, the Crows were heavily tipped to account for us very easily, but after they got the first couple of goals, the Eagles clicked into gear in a way that I hadn't seen in over 2 years. The ball movement was fast and precise, and for the first time in a while, the forwards were actually having the ball delivered to them on a platter rather than just bombed to the top of their heads. After the Crows' fast start, the Eagles actually kicked 10 of the next 12 goals to run away with the game easily. While on paper this game may look like an innocuous away win, but for me, and I think a lot of Eagles fans, this for me represents the turning point under Adam Simpson. The Eagles would then go on to win 4 of their last 5 games, and they were unlucky not to win that 5th game with a bad free kick going against us against Essendon, but it would only be bad luck that would deny us a finals berth that year. In the final round of the season, Sydney, who was sitting top of the ladder, rested a bunch of players, including Buddy Franklin, to play Richmond, and ended up dropping the game, and Richmond leapfrogged us to play finals that year. So Simpson would finish 9th in his first season, but I think towards the end of their year, the way we played and that new brand of football really brought around some optimism for Eagles fans, and we thought next year really could be the year we'd start moving up the ladder. Now Matt Priddis, who is probably the most debated Eagles player ever to play for us, remarkably won the Brownlow at the end of the 2014 season. Now while Priddis certainly had his fans amongst Eagles supporters, he certainly had just as many detractors, and the basis for that is that while he was an absolute clearance machine, many had doubts about his lack of pace and two-way running, and there were some doubts that whether or not we could actually build a premiership winning midfield with him at the centre. Those who disagreed felt his skill set was invaluable and we just needed to add A-grade midfielders around him. But in any case, a Brownlow medal in that year meant that Simo was going to back Priddis to the hilt. He was definitely not going anywhere, so we had to figure out a plan to support around it. So going into 2015, our expectations were definitely a little bit higher now. We'd done our time out of the top 8, and it was time to return to where we belonged, playing finals footy. That was until we lost 2 important key backs in Mitch Brown and Eric McKenzie to ACLs early in the season. The question was then, how could we possibly build a defence without those 2 key pillars? They were very important players at that point, and guys like McGovern and Shepherd really hadn't announced themselves in the competition to that point. So I think as Eagles fans, we all had to reset our expectations a little. Maybe finals was a little bit difficult to achieve that year, but nonetheless, we wanted to see free-flowing football and development of some of the younger guys. We had a sort of shaky start to the year after that. In round 1, we nearly beat the Bulldogs, who at the time we didn't think were a good side, but ended up finishing top 5, and I thought we played pretty good football. And then in round 2, we annihilated Carlton. But in round 3, we had probably the most bizarre Western Derby I've ever seen. Fremantle kicked the first 11 goals of the game and led by 80 points early in the 3rd quarter. But after that point, we turned it on and somehow only lost the game by 30 points. Now at the time, people rationalised that as Fremantle simply took their foot off the pedal and let us catch up because the game was well and truly dead. And to be fair, that is a pretty reasonable explanation, but all things considered, that really was more of a foreshadowing of the Eagles side that was about to emerge in the second half of the year. After that, we went on an absolutely magic run. We won 6 of our next 6, and although it was against fairly easy opposition, the way we won was so convincing. Nick Nat was dominant in the ruck, and Elliot Yeo was announcing himself as a midfielder forward of the future. On top of that, the midfield unit in general actually looked like it was breaking even with opposition teams rather than just getting smashed and letting our forwards and backs compensate. But most impressively of all, we managed to establish the Weagles web that year, which was a rolling defensive zone based around interceptions led by Jeremy McGovern, Shannon Hearn, Brad Shepherd, and Will Schofield, who were all fairly unheralded players with the exception of maybe Shannon Hearn up until that point. Despite having our 2 key pillars down back out, we'd actually improved as a defensive unit. Now, while we were winning games convincingly, we still had the question mark over us as to whether we could beat quality teams. But not only quality teams, but quality teams at the MCG. So in round 12, we came up against Richmond, and this was a huge test for us. We were 3rd on the ladder, and it was time to test our mettle against a quality side at the G, and we ended up pulling out one of the best performances I'd seen all year. Nick Nat and the midfielders dominated the clearance battle, and the forwards got on the end of their work to share in the spoils, and we ended up keeping them goalless in the last quarter and shooting into the top 2 with a huge 20-point win. It was at that point I think everyone considered the Eagles a genuine premiership contender for 2015. We ended up finishing the year in 2nd spot, drawing a home final against the Hawks. Suddenly, in the space of 12 months, Simpson had taken us from being a young quality side who was struggling to fulfill their potential to a genuine contender and definitely one of the big boys of the competition. Going into that final series, despite finishing behind Fremantle, we were widely considered the best challenger to Hawthorn for the premiership. Now, playing Hawthorn in week 1 was always going to be a tough battle, considering we'd already lost to them a few weeks previous in Perth. And on top of that, Priddis and Maston were listed as late outs to weaken our midfield. So to be honest, I don't think many of us expected what we actually saw in that game. We brought the intensity early, we piled on the pressure onto Hawthorn, and we somehow kept them to their lowest first half score ever in a final. Somehow we actually stretched the lead to 50 points going into the final term before holding on for a 32-point win. The lead was stretched to 50 points going into the last quarter, and we managed to hold on for a 32-point convincing win, and it could not be denied at this point. We were the clear Premiership favourites. At that point, it seemed like we were destined for a grand final appearance. All that stood between us and the last weekend in September was the 8th placed North Melbourne in Perth. Now, this prelim final will probably be remembered as my least favourite Eagles win in a final.
Some thought this was mission impossible for the Kangaroos, and on the quarter time siren, they led it by 20 points.
North dominated the first half and were unlucky not to lead by more than 4 goals, but thankfully we overpowered them and ended up winning by something like 20 points. But with that out of the way, it was time for the big one. Simpson was coming up against his old mentor and the Hawthorn Football Club in the grand final. Now, I felt we were really ready for this grand final. I felt like we couldn't have been in a better position. We had the mental edge over Hawthorn, having just beaten them a few weeks earlier. We'd already proven we could win at the MCG that year, and on top of that, we'd only left Perth to travel once in the previous 7 weeks. I was actually at the game, and I remember the glory I felt when Nick Nat tapped it to himself and won the clearance out of the opening centre bounce and surged it forward. And when Shuey got that goal from a high tackle in the opening minutes, I was sure we were going to win the game. Now, as you all know, I could not have been more wrong about that. Hawthorn put on an absolute clinic, and they were just piling on goal after goal. Rioli was banging home goals for fun, and when Luke Hodge kicked that stupidly ridiculous goal right in front of me in the pocket, I knew Hawthorn were absolutely destined to win the flag from that point. It pains me to say it, but Hawthorn played to a level that day that we just did not have in us. This was our first chance at a flag in a decade, and just like that, it was gone. The Hawks ended up smashing us by 46 points to record a historic three-peat, and all we were left to do is shake our heads and wonder where it all went wrong. Was it stage fright? Was it the MCG? Or were we just not good enough? When you lose a grand final, it's always such a bittersweet reflection. I was so proud of the effort for us to go from 9th to 2nd in the space of a year. I knew the boys could do it. But equally, I was a little bit deflated because you never know when your side is going to get back at a grand final again. What an incredible effort it was to transform that backline with those injuries. And I guess we have to think, were those injuries the actual making of Jeremy McGovern as the player he is today? Who knows? But from my view, at that point, the midfield was still the glaring weakness. But Simpson was very proactive that off-season, trying to improve the list. Matt Rosa, Scott Selwood and Callum Sinclair all left the club that off-season, but we replaced them with Jack Redden and Lewis Jetta, who at the time I thought were upgrades on the players we had. We also had Scott Lysett in the wings waiting for us to replace Sinclair, so at the time this looked like very shrewd business. But anyway, on to 2016 and our mission for revenge, and we wouldn't have to wait long before we played the Hawks again away at the MCG, and it was like somebody hit copy and paste on that game. The Hawks absolutely belted us in the exact same way they did at the grand final, and a lot of us thought this was a really bitter loss and a really weak sort of response in our first opportunity to avenge that game. We had a really tough couple of months to start that season. We had tough away games against the Hawks, Swans and Cats, and all of them ended up in beltings. The new recruits in particular that I mentioned, like Jetta and Redden, were really struggling, and it was really not a place of optimism. Amid a few percentage boosting wins, we suffered some average losses, including a really particularly bad one against the Crows in Perth, and it was really hard to see us mounting a real challenge for the Premiership that year. Following the bye, we were able to make up a little bit of ground with some wins against easy opposition, and going into the final 3 rounds, we sat 13 and 6, which on paper is actually a very good position to be in. The downside to that, however, was that the league was top heavy that year, so at 13 and 6, we still sat in 6th position. On top of that, we had a tough run home against the Giants, Hawks and Crows, and 2 of those games were away from home. At that point, it did look like top 4 was gone, and with that, any chance of a premiership. To our credit though, we pulled out a brilliant 3-game run that made us all believe in this side again. First game of which we played the Giants away from home in Sydney. As I'm sure you all remember, the first of this 3-game run was that famous game where Nick Nat-Nui kicked the goal on the siren basically to beat the Giants by 1 point. This game was special not just because of the heroic moment in which Nick Nat won us the game, but the context of the season for where it was at. Giants were higher than us on the ladder. They were in the top 4 and we were trying to climb our way in, and we were basically not really considered a massive chance to win the game. We trailed by 4 goals in the last quarter, but we slowly pegged them back. And when Nick Nat kicked that goal, you just had that belief that maybe we were actually one of the best sides in the competition. Maybe we were just a sleeping giant, and all the form before that was all misleading. It will go down as one of the most famous wins in Adam Simpson's tenure, let alone West Coast history. And the fact that we just proven we could beat a top 4 side away, maybe we were a chance at the flag after all. But the joy was short-lived. The following week, we absolutely pantsed Hawthorn, and while we played really, really good football, Nick Naitanui went down with a tragic ACL, and I think most of us felt like this probably ruined our chances for a flag. There was a belief that Naitanui was super important to our midfield mix because he papered over a lot of cracks. Maybe our midfield wasn't good enough without him tapping the ball to their advantage. I think there was a little bit of validity in that. So when he went down, it was really, really sad, both on a personal level for him, but also for the premiership chances of the club. But we ended up winning that game, and they kind of proved us wrong the following week. We took on Adelaide at Adelaide Oval, and we absolutely thumped them. They were one of the best teams that year. In fact, they were in the top 4 and were actually equal first on points, but 4th on percentage. And we absolutely creamed them. We were leading by 50 points late in the last quarter. So at that point, I believe we were back to our best. And if there was ever going to be a team to win from outside the top 4 that year, I biasedly believe that the Eagles were the team to do that. Now, there's a lot of irony in what happened the week after that. We took on the Dogs in Perth in elimination final, and we got absolutely pants. I just kept expecting us to come back every time the Bulldogs got away with a few goals, but from start to finish, we were absolutely outclassed and outplayed. And as you all know, the Bulldogs ended up being the first team to win a flag from 7. Now, looking back, that year I think will be looked upon as an abject failure because we went out in the first week of the finals. But if you look a little bit closer, we finished the year with 16 wins and 6 losses with a percentage of 130%, which most years gets you top 2 and is actually statistically better than our 2018 flag winning year. Although we did lose in the first week of the finals, we also came up against the eventual premiers who played to a standard no one else could match in that final series. So while it was a brutal end to the season, I think that side is a little bit better than a week 1 exit will actually demonstrate. It was definitely a wasted season, but it could also serve to be the kick up the arse we actually needed. Make no mistake, that Nick Naitanui ACL injury was pretty devastating, not just for that season, but for future seasons going into 2017 and beyond. We were pretty much going to be without him for all of that season, and there was still a huge question mark over whether our midfield was good enough to actually push for a premiership without his silver service. Now, during the off-season, it appeared we were going to keep our heads down with regard to recruitment before Kim Hagdorn broke an absolute bombshell story. We were about to sign Sam Mitchell from Hawthorn, not only as a coach, but as a player for 1 season. Now, for me, this was a really exciting recruitment. I personally was just excited to see him play in the midfield. Even at 34 years old, I thought he'd be one of our best midfielders. But obviously, this was more of a coaching-driven decision to secure Sam as an assistant coach for future seasons and beyond. But while the recruitment of Mitchell was really exciting for our midfield, it did appear as a top-up move. And a lot of fans had a problem with this because they thought we needed some new youth to regenerate the list and not necessarily top up with a 34-year-old who was also a bit slow, and while he was a gun player, him and Pritis in the same midfield really added fuel to the fire for those anti-Simpson and anti-Pritis fans. But to his credit, on-field Sam Mitchell had an immediate impact. In round 1 of the following season, he earned 3 votes and had something like 36 possessions as we smashed North Melbourne. The first month of that season went more or less to plan. We won 3 out of 4 games, and the only loss was against the eventual premiers Richmond at the MCG. Now, in round 5, we finally had a huge opportunity to beat Hawthorn at the MCG. We were playing them, and they were literally on the bottom of the ladder. And the previous week, they had lost to Gold Coast by 88 points. Many people believe that if we didn't win this opportunity to beat Hawthorn at the MCG, we were never going to beat them at the MCG. And sure enough, we turned up and got rolled by 50 points in the exact same way we lost the grand final. This was undeniably a huge blow for our season, but also I think it really kicked off the angst that was the 2017 season. After that, we really had a run of inconsistent performances. We had a big derby win, we beat Port Adelaide away, and then we also beat last year's premiers, the Bulldogs, in Perth. Then we were smashed by Essendon by 10 goals, and we really didn't even give them a whimper in that game. We then lost at home to GWS in Perth, and Kennedy did a long-term injury with his ankle, and then we lost to the Gold Coast by 3 points. By this point of the season, I think we'd well and truly established we were not premiership chances for this season, and I think a lot of us fans, including myself, wanted us to do a big push towards youth and developing the young players on our list. There was impatience around Pritis, Redden and Jetta, and even some people were a little bit sick of the Mitchell recruitment even though he was playing really well. The fact that we didn't have Nat Nui or Kennedy really, I think, made us look worse than we were as a list. Those guys really add so much to our playing group when they're on the field. We were also playing the same tired old 22 every week with limited change, no youth. But the question also was, who was the youth on our list? Luke Partington was pretty much the only candidate in the waffle who was fit and ready to play. I remember we were going to play Dan Venables in round 15, I think, against Geelong. He was told he was going to play, and then he busted his ankle and missed the rest of the year, or actually I think it was his toe. For me, while we were playing inconsistent football, I think this was probably the most frustrated I'd ever been with Adam Simpson as our coach. The reason being, as a fan, you always want to be believing in a direction. So you're either backing your 22 in to win games and play finals and beyond, or you want to be developing that 22 for the future. And at the moment, it felt like we were doing neither. The 22 that we were playing was just playing crap football, and we're good enough to beat some crap teams and sort of nestle in the middle of the ladder, but not really actually developing anyone who was going to take us forward in the future. To compound that frustration, Simpson and the club offered Pritis a 2-year extension with the club, and I found this really frustrating because while I'm no Pritis hater, I'm really not. I kind of thought this was an indication as to where the club thought we were at in terms of our list, and I thought they were a little bit deluded with where we were at, and I think we really needed to turn over the list really aggressively. But then a few weeks later, out of nowhere, a press conference was called and we were told a player was retiring. We all assumed it would be Sam Mitchell because he hadn't signed an extension, but lo and behold, it was Matt Pritis, which was a huge surprise given his extension 2 months earlier. Somehow Pritis had changed his mind about whether he was going to play on with the club. He was going to retire. He's citing it was the right time to go, but he was also told that he'll be playing more forward in the future, and I think he probably took exception to this. Playing forward was not his strong suit. He was pretty much a midfielder or bust, and I think there really must have been a turning point within the Eagles hierarchy where they established that Pritis wasn't part of their future plans and they needed some more midfielders to develop through in that role, and that's something I completely agreed with. And as much as I love Pritis as a bloke, I really respect their decision to not offer him that extension after all. It was a complete backflip from the club and Adam Simpson, but to me, I thought it was really positive and it showed they were realistic about where the list sat and that there was a clear need for regeneration. Now, don't get me wrong, I felt for Pritis undoubtedly, but I was also equally intrigued by the prospect of a new-looking midfield with some younger legs through it. Obviously, Shuey would be in there, but also some extended time into Yo and Sheed and maybe someone like Venables playing there in the future. Unsurprisingly, the inconsistent performances continued, and then a few weeks later, we had the retirements of Mitchell and Petrie announced for the end of the season as well. We had bad away losses against St Kilda and Collingwood, but then also the fact that we almost lost to Carlton in Perth really showed how far we had fallen. But we were dealt some luck in the final round. Melbourne somehow choked against Collingwood, and they left the door open for us. And while we were playing the ladder leaders Adelaide in the final round, we had to beat them by 4 goals to make finals on percentage. To add to the emotion of this game, this was potentially Pritis' last game, Sam Mitchell and Petrie as well, but also we were saying goodbye to Subiaco, which was our home for several decades. I actually don't know how long off the top of my head. The fact that Adelaide had already sewn up top spot and were travelling in the final week of the season played into our hands. We might just be able to snag a 4-goal win here and play finals. Thankfully, we pulled out one of our best performances for the entire season. We built a 4-goal lead early and managed to hold on for most of the day, and 3/4 time, we led by 5 goals, which meant we had 1 quarter to go in our season, and we just needed to hold on to play in finals. Lewis Jetta, as I touched on, was a much maligned player for most of his 2 years so far at West Coast, but he pulled out one of his best games of his career. It started with a heroic chase down on the wing of Charlie Cameron, and in a game where every goal counted, that was an absolutely huge effort. But he followed that up with an even bigger effort. I was caught up to within 17 points with just 5 minutes to go, and we trailed by 0.1% on Melbourne in the top 8. Suddenly, our entire season was borderline pointless if we didn't kick 1 more goal. In the dying minutes, Redden surged the ball deep into our forward line. The Crows defender gathered and tried a risky kick inside our 50. With a huge effort, Jetta leaps to intercept, gathers the crumb, and kicks a goal as Subiaco Oval erupts.
Now's his time to shine! He's covered in glory!
A minute later, Jack Darling marked courageously in the goal square to seal the win, and it was a beautiful send-off for Footy. In a season that was almost entirely wasted, that game gave us a sliver of relevance, and we were off to take on the Power at Adelaide Oval the following week in the first elimination final. Now, given that we were all kind of riding the high of the dramatic win the previous week, our expectations for this game were relatively low, despite the fact that we'd beaten them earlier that year in Adelaide. Port Adelaide's form line was strong. They'd won their last 3, including a 20-goal win in the final round of the season against Gold Coast. Again, it was an emotionally charged game because would it be the last game for Pritis, Petrie, and Mitchell? But it also kind of felt like a bonus that we were playing in this game at all. Miraculously though, the Eagles pulled out yet another fantastic game where they played the similar brand of football that won them the game the previous week. We kicked 7 of the first 9 goals of the game, and it was miraculous. We were finally playing like the team that made the grand final 2 years previous and won 16 games the year before. And you have to think, where was this style previous to this game? Why were we playing so shit all year only to pull it out now? The joy of that run didn't last long, however, obviously Port clawed their way back as we expected they would, and they completely eroded the lead we had by 3/4 time. The game descended into an absolute slog. It started going for goal, but it always felt like Port Adelaide were slightly in control. It was a dramatic last quarter. They led by 9 points, which at one point felt completely unassailable, and then Pritis and Petrie got goals, and we actually led the game by 1 point in the dying minutes. To add to the drama, Travis Boak pulls out nearly one of the goals of the year, but it just hits the post, and the scores are level at 60 all. With 40 seconds to go, it looked like Port might actually have the decisive inside 50 as Jasper Pittard surged the ball forward. The ball went off hands and just started rolling towards our goals. But of course, McKenzie gets there in time and pulls off one of the most courageous moves we've seen in an Eagles jumper for quite some time. And instead of rushing the ball through for a behind, he decides to grab the ball and cannon into the behind post. And that there and then was pretty much the difference between us losing the game and not losing the game, because of course we would have lost the game by a point. But we managed to hang on, and the scores were tied 60 all at full time, meaning we were going to extra time. That there and then was pretty much the difference between us losing the game in regulation time and not, and it will be forever remembered as one of the best individual acts in Eagles history. But of course, the game ended in a draw and we're going to extra time, and this would be the second time this has happened to the Eagles in a decade since we lost to Collingwood 10 years previous. The nerves of this game for an elimination final were absolutely way more trouble than it was actually worth. Of course, Port Adelaide skipped out to a 13-point lead. It looked like we were dead and buried, and then Lewis Jetta stands up with a brilliant centre clearance, surges the ball forward, and JK pegs one back, and somehow we're still alive. Kennedy then bobs up with another set shot goal, and the game once again is going to the absolute wire. With 27 seconds to go, we've got the ball in our forward pocket. It's a boundary throw in. Someone taps the ball down, someone handballs it to Shuey, and of course he gets taken high by an errant Jared Pollock tackle. He did admittedly a little bit duck into it, I'm not going to deny that, but absolutely everyone in the crowd just goes absolutely nuts. But all of us watching at home in Perth, we're absolutely stoked with that result. I'll never forget the moment he's lining up for goal. We all literally ran to different corners of the room that I was watching it. Somebody turns off the lights and we just watch Shuey walk back and cool as ice nail this goal that sends us through to week 2 of the finals. And suddenly out of nowhere, in one of the most frustrating seasons I've ever had as an Eagles fan, in 2 consecutive weeks we pulled off 2 of my best memories as an Eagles fan, beating Adelaide in Perth to make the finals by percentage, and then Luke Shuey nailing the goal after the siren to beat Port Adelaide in Adelaide. They were just fantastic games. It would all end pretty badly. The following week we travel to Sydney and get thumped by the Giants, and Pritis, Mitchell and Petrie would have a pretty sad game to finish up on, but to be honest, they were involved in 2 absolutely famous West Coast Eagles wins in their second and third last games. So all in all, not a bad end to the season from where it could have been halfway through the season. I thought we were definitely going to miss the finals. But regardless of the way that 2017 finished in that bright fashion, 2018 really needed to be a year of regeneration. You had all those players retiring, and we had a bumper draft crop. We put 5 picks in the top 37 because we absolutely scammed Gold Coast out of their draft picks. The list in general really just needed an influx of youth and talent to replace the outgoing veterans, in particular the midfield. But surprisingly, we went tall in the draft. I thought we were going to take a bunch of mids. We ended up going with Jared Brander and Oscar Allen with our first 2 picks, who I think are fantastic talents, but it ended up coming at a cost. We missed out on Tim Kelly in the draft, ended up taking Liam Ryan as well. But Overall, that was probably one of the best draft hauls we've had, and I was really, really happy with that particular strategy we took. I would have liked a couple of extra midfielders to add to the list. We ended up trading in Brendan Archie, who was probably a little bit of a maybe underappreciated talent at Port Adelaide. Wasn't quite getting the games maybe he was worthy of, but nonetheless, I thought he added a good sort of depth to our midfield. Overall, though, I was really happy with the decisions we made. Probably thought we could have been a little bit tougher on Jeddah, Lacroix, and Redden, who were all playing very average football up to that point, but Simpson backed them in, and with all that youth, I thought this year would be the year we start gifting games to some of our more talented youngsters. With guys from the previous draft as well, like Venables, Willa Rioli, and Jake Waterman, all fit going into 2018, we finally actually had youngsters on the list we could give games to, and I think in 2017, a lot of the talent we had was actually injured. This shift in thinking was clear and reflected in our selections as well, because we debuted Waterman, Venables, Rioli, and Ryan all in the first 2 rounds, and it made for a really exciting outlook on the season. I remember thinking I didn't really care necessarily if we made finals, but if we got games into this talented youth, similar to a few years ago, like in 2014, 2015, I thought if we could just get games into those guys and see a clear change in philosophy, I'd be pretty satisfied. In round 1, we would take on Sydney, and this was a particularly interesting game and exciting game for many reasons. We were debuting the new Optus Stadium, which we thought we might sacrifice a little bit of a home ground advantage as we adjusted to a new stadium. We were also debuting our new Royal jumper, which was fantastic and frankly a long time coming. I can't believe we actually ever wore navy. On top of that, we were excited to see the new kids on the list get a crack, and on top of that, I was interested to see the midfield mix without Pritis, and maybe someone like Elliot Yeo was finally going to get a full-time gig in the guts. That was exciting for me. But most exciting of all, perhaps, Nick Naitanui was making his long-awaited return from that ACL injury and what would be over 12 months out of the game. We didn't really care what sort of output it would be at first. We just wanted to see him get some kilometres in the legs. But to see him line up in round 1 against Sydney was super exciting. That round 1 game was bizarre for a number of reasons. We got done by the Swans by nearly 5 goals, but I remember walking away feeling strangely optimistic. I thought we played actually a really good brand of football. We looked fast, we looked skillful. Knick-knack magic almost won us the game at times, and they got a few junk time goals on us to maybe make the lead a little bit larger than what it probably deserved to be, but I thought we actually played really good football, and yeah, it was probably the most pleased I was after a loss in some time. Like I said, for me, it wasn't about the wins going into 2018, it was more about the improvement and change of philosophy. That's what I was intrigued to see. To everyone's surprise, we played the Doggies in round 2 at Marvel, and we absolutely thumped them, and Rioli debuted, and Venables kicked 3 goals, and pretty much we're ticking off every box that I'd wanted so far. But it wasn't until round 3 at around about half time against Geelong at Optus Stadium that I thought, hang on, we might actually be a pretty good team here. Geelong were obviously a top 2/3 side the previous year. They were probably top 2 going into the finals, and then obviously Richmond surprised everyone, but they were an absolutely quality outfit, and they just regained Gary Ablett to their side and were considered one of the Premiership favourites for this season. But at halftime, we were about 5 or 6 goals up, and we were actually playing red-hot football and looking every bit a top 4 team. I still remember a particular clearance in the second quarter where Nick Nat got the ruck tap and palmed it to Shuey over the top, who ran on to kick a goal from 50. And when that sort of thing is happening, is classic champagne football from West Coast. That is when they're playing their absolute best footy. Unfortunately, we kind of bottled the game from that point. We conceded the lead in about half a quarter after that, but then rallied and somehow won the game. But overall, it was a really pleasing performance. Anytime you beat a quality team like Geelong, anytime you get the result, that's a really positive result. So we were all pretty happy with it. After that, we were able to build our momentum a bit with some easy wins over the Gold Coast Blues and Dockers. But when we actually played Port Adelaide in round 7 and thumped them by about 7 goals, we were suddenly 6-1, and it was evident Simpson had actually turned us into a really quality side, and it looked like from 6-1 we were destined to play finals. For me though, the fortnight after that is the 2 weeks where I really believe West Coast were one of the best teams in the competition. The following week we played GWS away from home in Sydney, of course. Nick Naitanui was out with suspension, Shuey had done a hammy, and I believe McGovern was out for, I can't remember, it was probably injury, but either way we were missing some really key players. We brought in some guys, even Braden Ainsworth made his debut. I thought we were really paper thin on depth, but we somehow beat them. We pulled out a fantastic performance. performance. Never really looked too much in doubt of getting the result. And that was when I really believed Simpson was onto something good here. You know, when your team doesn't necessarily have all the personnel, but the system is so strong that you can cycle new players into it and perform to a similar level, that's the sign of a really strong team. So at that point, was a really, really good time to take Richmond on next week in Perth as a massive test to see exactly where we were at. To me, it was incredible the change from last year. The notable changes we saw were Elliot Yeo came into the mix as a big-bodied inside midfielder. Darling was suddenly in career best form as a key forward, and Lacroix was returning to form as well as a medium lead-up forward. Probably the best football we'd seen from him in a number of years. Shuey and Gaff were actually playing probably career best football as well in the guts, but on top of that, Nick Nat and Vardy and Lysat were all doing a great job tapping it down to them as well. Lewis Jetta and Shannon Hearn were really establishing themselves as some of the best defenders offensively in the competition as well, with their ball use coming out of the back half, which really was part of our trademark as a club. And on top of that, the push we had from the youth, getting guys like Ryan, Rioli, Venables, Petrocelli and Waterman all through the side really added some speed and flexibility, in particular their running power, really added a different dynamic to this side. And it was really what I had been asking for a long time, but we finally had the guys fit and able to play on the park. And of course, playing Richmond, who were the Premiership side, obviously, and probably best team in the competition to that point, was a huge challenge. And again, we didn't even have Shuey. He was still out for a number of weeks with that hamstring injury. And after an even first half, we absolutely torched them. At that point, I felt like it couldn't be denied. We were absolutely the real deal, and so much so that Dad and I actually bought tickets to the grand final that very week. We went into the mid-season bye at 10-1, not having lost since round 1, and suddenly this was the best team we'd seen under Adam Simpson. As you'd expect, after a long 10-game winning streak, we had a bit of a mid-season slump, but we rallied against the Pies in round 17. We hadn't beaten the Pies at the G for like 23 years up until that point. The Pies had also actually leapfrogged us on the ladder to go into second spot, and we were third, so it was a huge game in the context of the top four and the composition of that as well. Unfortunately, we suffered a cruel blow. Nick Nat-Nui did his second ACL in the space of 2 years. We managed to run away with a fantastic win, a 6-goal win, and somehow we actually got better after Nick Nat's ACL, kind of similar to how we did in 2016 as well, but you couldn't hide Simpson's emotion after the game. He was almost in tears, and it's clear how important Nick Nat is to this side, both from an on-field perspective, but also his presence and leadership as well. I think a lot of us felt at that point that we've been dealt a cruel blow to our premiership chances. But then 3 weeks after Nick Nat's ACL injury, something equally devastating happened, at least from my perspective. It was Derby 48 and Andrew Gaff's playing on Andrew Brayshaw, and he absolutely loses his mind and smacks him in the face with his fist. This for me is one of the hardest, probably the hardest moment I've ever had as an Eagles fan. You always like to, as a fan, be able to defend your players, but this mind-melting moment from Gaff where he just loses it and smacks Brayshaw in the face, it's indefensible. You know, I was really, really sad for both Brayshaw, and deep down I still think Gaff's a good bloke, so I felt sympathetic for him. And of course, he got suspended for 8 weeks, basically ruled him out for the rest of the season. So both in an emotional perspective of losing Gaff and feeling bad for him, but also there's the on-field perspective of losing one of our best players that year. To lose him and Nick Nat in such quick succession was, I think, the point where a lot of us probably lost hope that we were going to win the flag that year. We were obviously both sympathetic for Gaff, but also really angry at the effect this had caused for us, and also there was talk of him leaving the club to North Melbourne, which really just didn't really help. We were also clearly not playing the same level of football we were in the first half of the season, so it was quite easy for us to convince ourselves that we were going to fall away. One pick-me-up, however, was the remarkable win the following week against Port Adelaide. Obviously, we had all the emotion over the Gaff thing, but the fact that we managed to do that to Port Adelaide 2 years in a row was absolutely incredible. We played terribly that game and managed to win somehow, which was brilliant considering we had 2 bad losses then to Melbourne and North Melbourne. and still managed to keep in touch with the top two, which is a massive relief, and managed to lock it in with a final round win up at the Gabba against the uprising Brisbane Lions. Even the fact that we locked in top two, I think the fact that obviously the memory of how everything went in 2015, but also all the adversity we'd faced recently in 2018, it was hard to get too excited about that. And I felt there was a clear difference in Simpson's demeanour and generally the playing group in terms of talking to the media. I remember in 2015, Simpson had this real confident air about him. When we locked in the top two, I remember him saying, "We're here to win a flag, we're here to win a premiership." And this year there was a clear difference, pretty much trying to shut everyone down and just be like, no, we're just focusing on 1 week at a time. And I think that was probably from maybe a lesson he'd learned in 2015 about getting too ahead of yourself. I'm not too sure, but it was clear there was a different mindset going this time. So we would play the Pies in the first week of the finals, in the qualifying final at home in Perth. And just when we thought we had all the adversity we were going to get this year, Brad Shepherd lunges for a defensive kick out of the back 50 and tears his hamstring off the bone to pretty much end his season there and then. Look, every team has unfortunate injuries and heartbreaking injuries as well, so I know there's not too much to complain about, but between Gaff, Natanui and Shepherd going in about a 4-week period, this was really, really hard to take as an Eagles fan. In terms of the final, the game was level pegging for most of the game, but I always kind of felt that Collingwood had the upper hand. The game was going goal for most of the last term, and I think with 5 minutes to go, the Pies led by 2 points. Then, in eerily similar fashion to what happened 2 years previous, Lewis Jetta stood up. In the same part of the ground as against the Adelaide Crows, Jetta pounced on an interception, gathered the ball, turns and snapped to put the Eagles in front. That and the fact that he did the Cristiano Ronaldo celebration made it an Eagles iconic moment, and we went on to win the game by 2 goals. Now on the other side of the country, we had a rampant Demon side dispose of Geelong and Hawthorn in consecutive weeks, and they surged into a prelim final against us in Perth. Now I know I'm typically not an optimistic fan, I'm quite a pessimist and a nervous fan. I felt really uncomfortable with this game knowing our injuries, their momentum, and the fact that they'd beaten us in Perth just 4 weeks previous. I was worried that all the adversity we had faced in 2018 up to that point would eventually bury us and that it would be a wasted season. But of course, what we actually got from this Eagles side that day absolutely blew my mind.
Better together. And I'm out the way, and I'm out the way. Better together. And I'm out the way, and I'm out the way. I know what
The atmosphere at Optus Stadium that day was electric. I was in attendance. We had 60,000 die-hard Eagles fans screaming, and I knew if we got a couple of early ones, we could psych them out mentally. Well, we got that and more. The intensity we brought to that game was literally the best I'd seen us play all year, and that is saying something. That was a very high bar. Early in the game, Jordan Lewis made an uncharacteristic error with a bad handball out of defence. Josh Kennedy pounced on it and snapped the goal, and from that point, we never looked back, and we kicked the first 11 goals of the game. At halftime, the lead was 63 points, and the game was virtually over, and I remember having a tear in my eye as we had the MCG chant going around the stadium early in the third quarter. We won the game in emphatic fashion, winning by 11 goals, and we were through to our second grand final under Simpson in just 4 years. In the other prelim, of course, Collingwood had absolutely annihilated Richmond out of nowhere to book a grand final berth, and considering Richmond had won 22 games at the MCG consecutively up until that point, this was probably the best grand final matchup we could have hoped for. So Dad and I were rewarded for our faith for buying tickets in round 9 to the grand final, and we were off to Melbourne to see the boys play. Like I said earlier, there was a clear difference in demeanour, and it was really evident. You could tell the boys really didn't want to repeat any mistakes from 2015. But early in the grand final, you could be forgiven for thinking they had done just that. Collingwood banged home the first 5 goals of the grand final, and each roar was absolutely sickening sitting there in the stands, and of course it brought back memories of the 2015 grand final. On the positive side, we weren't actually playing badly. I think a lot of the goals Collingwood got were through pure talent of their own and some bad luck on our part. But then again, also in 2015, I didn't think we were playing that badly. Hawthorn just played ridiculously well. Crucially though, just before quarter time, we got a lucky goal through Rioli, and then JK backed it up, slotting one from the pocket. And suddenly we weren't down by quite as much, and you really felt like we were kind of in this game. I think those goals were really crucial in terms of momentum because if we hadn't got them, I felt like coming out of that quarter-time huddle would have been a lot more difficult for the boys. The second quarter sort of started in similar fashion. De Goey kicked another belter of a goal, and then we got a couple of late goals through Hutchings and Shuey to make up ground, and we were only down by 12 points at halftime, which felt ridiculous. Now, the third quarter was different. We definitely controlled play then, but we couldn't quite always put it on the scoreboard. We slowly pegged them back, but I certainly couldn't relax until we had hit the lead. Jack Darling was instrumental in that third term. He was a player that really struggled in the 2015 grand final with that horrendous drop chest mark being an iconic moment as well. But he really stood up in that third term. We were starting to dominate the air, which is really, really important for the Eagles gaining ascendancy. It wasn't until the dying minutes of the third term that we managed to hit the lead. Elliot Yeo pounced on a terrible Taylor Adams missed kick out of the back half. There's a lot of talk about the runner getting in the way, but frankly, Elliot Yeo was never not going to get to that terrible kick. He kicked the goal. We hit the lead for pretty much the first time since the opening minutes, and you could see in his face how huge that goal was. Of course, it was iconic for us because it was the first time we'd hit the lead in earnest, but also I think Yeo was another player who struggled in 15 and was tagged in this grand final after a brilliant qualifying final. You could see in his face how important that goal was to both him and the team, and to us, for us to lead late in the third term of a grand final, that was absolutely huge. Of course, we went into the final change all even, and that joy didn't really last too long with Myercheck and Jordan De Goey kicking 2 belter goals to start the final term. And I remember thinking, again, I'm very negative, but I remember thinking that we couldn't overcome that momentum shift. Collingwood had it in the bag from here, surely. As a Collingwood fan, you'd be absolutely pumped with those 2 goals. They were absolutely unreal as well. You'd be very confident at that point. But in typical fashion, this Eagles side hit back and Vardy goaled within less than a minute. It was symptomatic of this Eagles team under Adam Simpson. We always had a response. Then somehow we let Mason Cox take a mark and kick a goal, but then Kennedy had his own response with a brilliant goal from the pocket. We trailed by 5 points, and that made for an agonising last 15 minutes. We controlled the play, but missed simple set shots through Kennedy, Bryan and Maston. Football's such an important momentum game, and it's so important to nail your opportunities when you have them because they don't come along all that often, especially in a tight grand final like this. I remember when I saw Domshi take the mark in that pocket, my only expectation for him was, no disrespect to him, that I just wanted us to score a point, lock the ball inside 50 and generate another shot on goal. I really had no expectation on Sheed going back and slotting the goal, and as you can see in the following clip, that's what made the moment all the more glorious.
Massive. Sheed from the boundary.
Somehow he pulled off this amazing kick, and in that moment, literally all the emotions of the game hit me at once. I was tense and silent up to that point, but just there and then I burst into tears. It was amazing to think we were 4 points up with 2 minutes to go in a grand final. I think it really overwhelmed me how close I was to achieving pretty much the only thing I'd wanted throughout my whole adult life. Other than Jack Darling giving us all heart palpitations with that unforgettable drop mark in the goal square, we controlled the last 2 minutes and held on for an amazing grand final victory. 10 years after the club had imploded after the Cousins and Judd saga, the Simpson and Worsfold built list had finally achieved what we all knew it could. For me, there was a real beauty in the fact that the original nucleus of the squad got there to enjoy this premiership. Guys like Kennedy, Hearn, Lacroix, Shuey, Darling, McGovern, to name a few. It was a testament to the squad that Woosha had begun to build, but then Simpson came in and polished off through trades with guys like Elliot Yeo, Jack Redden, Lewis Jetta, and Nathan Vardy, just to name a few. While we all knew that this squad had the talent to go all the way, it took someone like Simpson to come in and consolidate that talent by driving a really strong culture. On top of that, we needed someone to come in and develop a game plan and strategy that would suit our strengths, namely aerial ability, our speed, and our skill, and Simpson did that beautifully. Now, when Eagles fans learned that Adam Simpson was taking over the coaching job at West Coast, we'd hope he'd brought some of the brand of football over from Hawthorn that would lead to a really successful period. Now, while we haven't won a three-peat or anything like that, what we have got is an ultra-competitive side that competes year in and out, gives themselves the best chance to win a flag by consistently making finals, and we've also won a grand final and lost a grand final in such a short period as well. I'd say we well and truly got what we asked for. On top of that, we have some of the best tools in the league, Probably boasts the best ball movement and foot skills out of any club as well. Under the Simpson era, we've returned to being perennial finalists. In the modern game, the big clubs like Sydney, Geelong and Hawthorn try to make finals and finish high every single year to give themselves a chance of winning the flag, and that's clearly what we've endeavoured to do under Simpson. In his 6 seasons at the West Coast Eagles, we've only missed the finals once, and in 4 out of the 5 years we did play finals, we won a final. The only year that we did miss the finals, we finished 9th, and we were arguably well and truly a top 8 side in quality at the end of that season as well. In 2018, we saw Simpson's philosophy really change towards driving youth development alongside trying to win every game as well, and that's the best way I feel to avoid lengthy rebuilds like our purple neighbours down the road. Now, as we know, our Premiership defence in 2019 didn't go as planned. But 15 wins and 7 losses is a very respectable ratio, and in 2016 and 2017, Richmond and the Bulldogs, who won the flags, went 15 and 7 as well. I'd say last year we probably just lacked that hunger and drive to go again and win the flag, and that's what ultimately cost us. But I think in 2020 we're not going to have that problem. Next year we're going to have Tim Kelly added to the list, and hopefully, fingers crossed, a fit Nick Naitanui tapping it down to him and the rest of the midfielders. The age profile of our list is still really strong, and I truly believe that with a bit of luck we are still a Premiership contender for the next few seasons at least. And if we pull it off, who knows? Adam Simpson might just surpass Mick Malthouse as the greatest West Coast Eagles coach.